Hello, my name is June. I am a bass music producer, DJ, sound designer, music educator, and today I wanted to talk about how chords aren't really chords. If you ask a music teacher what a chord is, the answer they'll probably give you off the top of their head is a chord is any 3 or more notes being sounded simultaneously. However, consider a small jazz saxophone trio featuring drums, saxophone, and bass. Assuming that both the saxophone and the bass player are playing monophonically, meaning that at any given time they're only playing one note, we will never hear more than 2 notes at a time. But that doesn't mean that these performers aren't using chord progressions or that they're not thinking about chord progressions. Instead, what they're doing is they're constructing melodic lines that reflect the underlying chord progression. If you've been interested in spicing up your chord progressions in the past, you've probably come across videos with thumbnails like this. The implication here being that more notes equals more interesting chord progression. And writing parts like this definitely has its place. I'm not here to knock it. However, I think it also takes a certain level of musical maturity to realize that what a musical situation needs is for you to pull back a little bit. It's also worth recognizing that we have kind of a shared musical grammar. When we hear a jazz saxophone trio playing standards, we as listeners can still hear the chord progression, even though we may not be hearing every single note of a chord at any particular time. So we're going to treat our DAW today like the aforementioned saxophone trio. But before we get into the actual tutorial, I want to remind everyone that I have a Patreon where I release monthly sample packs, patreon.com/June_Bernie. All $1 and up contributors get access to every single sample pack that I've ever made, and making these videos takes a lot of time and energy, so any support is very much appreciated. With that, let's hop into the DAW. So I have 4 tracks up already. The first thing I did was I wrote a drum part. I was going for like a 140 deep dubstep kind of vibe. In this top track, I have some synth pads. On this second track, I have a flute. Spicy. And then on this third track, I have a respace. So the goal here is to outline a chord progression using just the flute and the respace. We are going to use the synth pads, but they're not actually going to make it into our final arrangement. They're only there so that we can hear the chord progression in full, and then we will construct our lines around them, and finally delete the chord progression. So let's open up this first MIDI clip. You can see in the scale selector, I have selected the key of F-sharp Phrygian. If you want to learn more about Phrygian and other modes of the major scale, I highly recommend my video on modes. However, any scale will work in this case. I'm going to talk a little bit about how to write a basic chord progression, but I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on it. So let's just start with the root notes of the chords. Given that we're in the key of F-sharp Phrygian, it makes sense for our first note to be F-sharp. And typically speaking, chords like to move in one of 2 ways, either in fourths or in seconds. So I'm going to go from F-sharp to B in my second measure. This is the 4th of the key because F-sharp is our 1, G is our 2, A is our 3, and B is our 4. Next, I'm just going to move stepwise down the scale, A, and then G, so that we can lead back to F-sharp, and then the whole cycle repeats again. Now, up from these root notes, we're going to stack thirds. I'm going to do 7th chords in this example. However, you can definitely stick to 3-note chords if that better suits your musical identity. So F-sharp is our 1, G is our 2, and A is our 3rd. And then up from A, skip B, play C sharp, skip D, play E. Now we do the same for all the other chords. B is our 1, C sharp is our 2, D is our 3rd. Skip E, play F sharp, skip G, play A. A is our 1, skip B, play C sharp, skip D, play E, skip F sharp, play G, etc. with the rest of the chords. Let's listen to this chord progression we just wrote. I think that's appropriate for what we're going for. So we're done writing this part, but I want to talk about the individual notes in each chord and what purpose they may serve so that we can make more educated decisions about our melody and our bass line. Let's start with the root of each chord. We're not doing any fancy inversions here, so the root notes are just whatever note is on the bottom of the chord. F sharp, B, A, and G. The root note is a stabilizing force. It is the safest and frankly most boring note that you could play on top of the chord. That stability is really, really important. There may be situations where you want to get really out there and not play the root note, but for the most part, it's going to be really, really difficult to really hear the chord without hearing the root note. The next note up from the bottom, we call the third. In this case, it's A. In this case, it's D. In this case, it's C sharp. In this case, it's B. The third is one of the notes that's going to give each chord its unique quality. It's sometimes called a color tone for this reason. It is the note that is going to tell us whether this chord is major or minor, whether it's happy or sad. So this is also a very important note to have represented in your melodic lines. Third up from the bottom, we call this note the fifth. The fifth is another stabilizing force, kind of like the root. However, if you want something that has a lot of color and a lot of character to it, the fifth is a safe choice for a note to omit. You can actually hear that if I delete this note in the chord, and then play it back, we don't actually really lose much of the chord. Let's listen to it again with the fifth, and then without the fifth. I'm going to keep it in this pad sound for now. Just know that it's not really the most important note in a chord. And this top note, we call the seventh of the chord. It's another color tone, kind of like the third. However, I might argue that the seventh is less essential to the identity of the chord than the third. It's sometimes said that extensions like this, 7th, 9th, 13th, 11th, all that kind of stuff, is kind of like your chord just wearing a fancy hat. I really like when chords have these fancy hats. However, it may not be something that you want to emphasize in your arrangement. So just to wrap this up a bit, the root and the fifth are both stabilizing forces, and the third and the seventh are both color tones. They add character to the chord. This is going to be important as we start constructing our melodic lines. Now that we've constructed our chord progression and we've talked about the roles that different notes in the chord play, let's move on to constructing our bass line. I will select both the Chords MIDI clip and the Bassline MIDI clip so that I can see both at the same time. And we're going to construct our bass line for now using only whole notes, meaning a note that takes up an entire measure. And the first note I'm going to play is F sharp, the root of our first chord. Again, you can hear that it sounds very stable, it sounds very safe, and that's what we want at this particular moment. Now in the second chord, I could play a B. However, I notice that the fifth of this chord is also an F sharp, so I can just stay on F sharp, and that is exactly what I'm going to do. Let's listen to how that sounds. So the bass is still adding stability there because we're playing the fifth. You might say that's a little less stable than playing the root, which I think is actually nice in this circumstance. Next, in this third chord, I actually think I'm going to target the third. Remember that the third is a color tone in this instance. So at this moment, we're experimenting with a little bit more instability. However, I think that C sharp will work really well, specifically because it's a perfect fifth from F sharp, which again is a kind of stable root motion that we can expect from a chord progression. And this leap of a fifth from F sharp to C sharp is a very stable and comforting sound. Finally, in this last chord, I think I'm just going to go back down to F sharp because F sharp is the seventh of this chord. So back down to F sharp. And I will duplicate these four notes over into the next four measures. However, I want to change this last note. I want there to be a little bit of variation from one 4-bar phrase to the next 4-bar phrase. So instead of playing an F sharp on this last chord, I'm going to play a D. So far what we have is this. I think this is sounding really, really good, so let's move on to our flute melody. Again, I'm going to select multiple MIDI clips so that I can see all of my parts at once. And let's decide on what notes we're going to play here. And we're going to be constructing this melody at first using just half notes, meaning each note takes up half the measure. So we're going to have an opportunity to play 2 notes per every chord. Let's start on the note A. Again, it's one of those characteristic color tones, so it will help us to find that F sharp minor 7 chord right off the bat. Next, I think I'm going to play the note E, again because it's a nice colorful tone. Let's place an E right here. So the only note of this F sharp minor 7 chord that isn't represented in the melody in the bass line is the 5th. And like I said earlier, the 5th is probably the least important note of all the notes in the chord. Next, on this B minor 7 chord, we have an F sharp in the bass, the chord's 5th. So I actually think that the first note we should play in this melody is the root. So let's place a B right here. And then I think the second note we should include is this D. Again, the third of the chord being one of the characteristic tones. On this A dominant 7 chord, we are playing a C sharp in the bass. So let's get an A in there, defining our root. And now we have the choice of either the E or the G to play for our next melody note. I think I'm going to go with G because it provides a little bit more color. Lastly, on this G major 7 chord, we are playing an F sharp in the bass, the chord's 7th. So let's do the third of the chord, B, and the root of the chord, G. Let's duplicate this melody line across, deactivate the chords, and listen to just the melody and the bass line together. Okay, I think that's pretty good. One thing that's standing out to me is this very last G. My ear right now is actually guiding me towards this F sharp in the chord. So let's play that instead. Okay, I actually think that's pretty good. And given that we're now playing an F sharp in the melody, let's move this F sharp in the bass to a G. Let's listen to the whole thing now. Okay, I think that actually works really, really well. You may even notice that on this last chord, this G major 7, neither the melody or the bass line is actually playing the root. I guess that would make it a B minor triad technically, but again, I'm kind of thinking about it in the context of G major 7. So we're still not done here. The rhythms are still very simple. You know, it's very, very rare that we have a bass line that's just whole notes, and it's very, very rare that we have a melody that's just half notes. I'm not going to change any of the notes of the bass line, I just want to change the rhythms. Okay, so we got the bass line to sit in the groove a little bit better. Now let's mess with the melody. I'm not going to do a ton rhythmically to the melody, I just want to add a few passing notes. A passing note in this case is a note that leads into one of the notes that we've already written. So for example, from this E to B, a good candidate for a passing note would be this C sharp because it leads stepwise into that B. So that would sound like this. I think that actually sounds nice. Let's also add a passing note from this G to this B. In this case, let's do another C sharp. Maybe we can do a B or an A rather instead. Actually, I think that's quite nice. Let's try a passing note into this G. So let's try an F sharp leading into this G. No, I think I'm going to leave that out for now. Let's again add that same passing note from E to B and from G to B. So now what we have is this. There we go. I think that sounds quite nice. So let's review a little bit what we've done so far. The first thing we did was we selected our key, in this case F-sharp Phrygian. The next step was to write some very, very basic chords in that key. Then we identified which notes in each chord are stabilizing tones and which ones are color tones. We then wrote a whole note bass line using mostly roots and fifths, because those are stabilizing tones. Then wrote a half note melody using mostly thirds and sevenths, because those are color tones. We removed the chords completely. Then we added rhythmic variation and passing tones to our bass line and melody. Now, of course, you can go much, much deeper with this. I'm just scratching the surface. But I hope it helps you understand two things. One, that a chord is not just a big stack of notes. And two, that making simplified, effective choices can bring about a lot of maturity and restraint in your lines. Thank you very much. If you enjoyed this video, consider liking, commenting, and subscribing. And consider becoming a monthly patron and get access to all of the sample packs I've made. I've got drum sounds, I've got bass sounds, I've got effects sounds, I've got fills, breaks, all sorts of stuff. Again, thank you very much for watching, and I hope to see you soon.
Yo, catch me at my darkest, feeling a spark to start shit. It's blood-stained fingers on a pen, feeling marvelous. The people already shown what is shown when you dig deep. 6 feet, if you can run.